New York City, October 1965. The Friars Club's grand ballroom glittered with old Hollywood glamour as television comedy's most legendary figures gathered for the annual Comedy Legends Roast. 180 of the industry's biggest names filled every table, from vaudeville veterans to television's newest stars, all assembled to celebrate the evolution of American humor. At table 9 sat Dick Van Dyke, relaxed and confident in his perfectly tailored tuxedo, that warm smile lighting up conversations with Reiner, Mel Brooks, and Neil Simon as they discussed the incredible success of The Dick Van Dyke Show. The evening should have been pure celebration for Dick. His television series was redefining comedy, proving that sophisticated humor could work on the small screen while maintaining mass appeal. Critics were calling it revolutionary, Emmy nominations were piling up, and Dick had become the face of television comedy's bright future. But across the ballroom, holding court at the head table like a dethroned king surveying his former kingdom, sat Sid Caesar. Sid was a giant of television comedy, the man who had literally invented the medium's possibilities with Your Show of Shows in the early 1950s. For nearly a decade, Saturday nights belonged to Sid Caesar, whose brilliant sketch comedy and innovative approach had made him the undisputed king of television entertainment. He'd worked with writers who would become legends, Mel Brooks, Reiner, Neil Simon, Larry Gelbart, and had proven that television could be an art form worthy of serious attention. But that was 15 years ago, and the crown had clearly shifted to younger performers like Dick Van Dyke. Sid had been drinking heavily throughout the dinner, his famous intensity amplified by alcohol and the bitter recognition that his era was ending. His recent shows had failed to recapture his early magic, his career was stalling, and watching this younger generation receive the accolades that had once been his was eating at him in ways he couldn't quite articulate. The sight of Dick Van Dyke laughing and gesturing animatedly at his table made something dark twist in Sid's chest. Here was this song and dance man from the Midwest, this pleasant personality who'd stumbled into television success, getting recognition that Sid felt belonged to serious comedy innovators who'd pioneered the medium. Dick, meanwhile, was genuinely enjoying the evening. He felt honored to be among comedy legends, grateful for his success, and excited about television comedy's future. When people mentioned Sid Caesar, Dick spoke with deep respect about the older comedian's contributions to television, about how Sid had proven the medium could handle sophisticated entertainment. But Sid interpreted Dick's success differently. What Sid saw was a lightweight performer who'd achieved fame without understanding the craft, someone who'd benefited from the foundation Sid and others had built without acknowledging the debt or earning the success through genuine innovation. The formal program began at 9 o'clock with introductions of various comedy legends. Milton Berle received a standing ovation. Jack Benny brought down the house with a single perfectly timed pause, and the atmosphere remained warm and celebratory. When Dick was called to present an award for innovation in television comedy, the applause was genuine and enthusiastic. "Ladies and gentlemen," Dick began, his voice carrying easily through the elegant ballroom. "Comedy has always been about evolution. Each generation builds on what came before, adding their own voice while honoring the pioneers who made their success possible." He paused, looking around at faces that had shaped American entertainment for decades. "When I started in television, I studied the masters who came before me. I watched Sid Caesar prove that television could handle complex sketches and sophisticated humor. I learned from Milton Berle that connecting with an audience was more important than impressing them. I saw how Jack Benny could get a laugh with just a look." Dick's speech was generous and inclusive, acknowledging different approaches to comedy without suggesting any hierarchy of importance. "The beautiful thing about our medium," Dick continued, "is that there's room for everyone to contribute something unique. Whether it's Sid's brilliant sketch work, Milton's variety show energy, or the kind of family sitcom I'm privileged to be part of, we all serve the same goal, bringing laughter and joy to people's lives." Sid's table had gone quiet. Several people glanced at him, trying to gauge his reaction to being mentioned with such obvious respect. "Television comedy's strength," Dick concluded, isn't in any single approach or performer. It's in our collective ability to keep finding new ways to make people laugh, to keep the medium growing and evolving while respecting the foundation laid by the giants who came before us. Dick received strong applause and returned to his table as the evening continued. But Sid's mood had darkened considerably. Being mentioned in Dick's speech felt patronizing to him, as if this television newcomer was graciously acknowledging the real comedy legends while positioning himself as their successor. As the formal program ended and people began to mingle, Sid's careful public persona began to slip. He stood from the head table with the exaggerated precision of someone who'd had too much to drink but was determined not to show it. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sid called out, his voice cutting through the ballroom conversations with that commanding presence that had made him famous. "May I have your attention for just a moment?" The room gradually quieted as people turned to see what the legendary Sid Caesar wanted to say. Dick looked up from his conversation with Carl Reiner, curious but not concerned. "I want to talk about something that's been on my mind tonight," Sid continued, his voice carrying that intensity that could fill a television studio. "We've heard a lot of beautiful speeches about evolution in comedy, about building on what came before, about the bright future of television entertainment." Several people nodded approvingly. This sounded like it might be a thoughtful reflection from one of the medium's pioneers. "But I think we need to be honest about something," Sid said, his tone beginning to edge toward confrontation. "There's a difference between evolution and dilution. There's a difference between building on a foundation and just benefiting from other people's work." The room was beginning to sense tension in Sid's words. "Now, I don't want to hurt anyone's feelings," Sid continued, though his tone suggested otherwise, "but I think it's important that we maintain some perspective about what real television comedy innovation actually looks like." Sid began to pace slightly as he spoke, his movements sharp and agitated. "Take Dick Van Dyke, for example," Sid said, gesturing toward Dick's table with a theatrical flourish that felt more attacking than acknowledging. "Everyone's calling him the future of television comedy, praising his innovation, talking about how he's revolutionizing the medium." The ballroom went completely silent. People stopped drinking, stopped talking, stopped moving as they realized they were about to witness a public confrontation. "But let's be honest about what Dick Van Dyke actually represents," Sid continued, his voice getting louder and more cutting. "Dick is a lucky amateur. He's a pleasant personality who stumbled into the right situation at the right time with the right writers." Dick's face remained composed, but something in his eyes was beginning to change. "Has Dick Van Dyke ever created anything from scratch?" Sid asked rhetorically. "Has he ever had to build a show from nothing, develop characters from the ground up, innovate new forms of television entertainment? Has he ever had to prove that the medium itself could handle sophisticated comedy?" Sid's voice was getting more theatrical, more condescending. "The answer is no. Dick Van Dyke walked into a ready-made situation created by people like Carl Reiner, performed in formats developed by people like me, and benefited from groundwork laid by performers who actually took risks when television was still figuring out what it could be." Gasps rippled through the crowd. This had crossed from industry commentary into personal attack territory. "Dick Van Dyke is very good at being Dick Van Dyke," Sid said with a dismissive laugh. "He's charming. He's likable. He can remember his lines and hit his marks. But that's not innovation. That's not creativity. That's not the kind of pioneering work that built television comedy." Sid looked directly at Dick. "So when I hear people calling Dick the future of television comedy, when I see him receiving awards for innovation, I have to speak up. Because real innovation requires real risk, real creativity, real understanding of the craft. And Dick Van Dyke is just a lucky amateur who happened to be in the right place at the right time." The silence that followed was unlike anything anyone in that ballroom had ever experienced. 180 people held their breath, waiting to see how Dick Van Dyke would respond to this devastating public humiliation. Dick stood up slowly, his movement deliberate and calm. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but carried clearly through the silent room. "Side," Dick said simply. Are you finished? I'm finished when someone acknowledges the difference between real comedy innovation and just being lucky enough to have good writers, Sid replied, swaying slightly but maintaining his confrontational stance. Dick walked to the center of the room, positioning himself where everyone could see him clearly. His movement was confident, unhurried, like a man who knew exactly what he intended to say. "All right," Dick said, his voice growing stronger. "Let's talk about innovation. Let's talk about what it means to build something versus tearing others down. And let's talk about the difference between being a pioneer and being bitter about not staying on top forever." Sid crossed his arms, his expression suggesting he was prepared for whatever defense Dick might offer. "Sid, you called me a lucky amateur," Dick continued. "You suggested that I haven't earned my success, that I've just benefited from other people's work, that I don't understand real comedy innovation." Dick looked around the room, making eye contact with various comedy legends. "Those are serious accusations, and I think everyone here deserves to understand what they really mean." Dick turned back to Sid, his voice becoming more pointed. "First, let's talk about luck versus preparation. You're absolutely right that I've been lucky. I was lucky to work with Carl Reiner, lucky to be part of a great writing team, lucky to be on a network that supported our vision. But Sid, luck only matters if you're prepared when opportunity comes." Several people in the audience began nodding. "I spent 15 years in summer stock, dinner theater, and nightclub work before I got my television break. I studied comedy, learned timing, developed skills, failed repeatedly, and kept working to get better. When the opportunity came, I was ready for it. That's not just luck, that's preparation meeting opportunity." Dick's voice was gaining strength and authority. "But let's talk about what you really mean when you call me an amateur, Sid. What you really mean is that you're angry about not being the center of attention anymore. What you really mean is that you can't stand watching someone else succeed in the medium you helped create." The room was completely focused on Dick now. "And that's what really bothers you, isn't it, Sid? It's not that I haven't earned my success. It's that my success reminds you that yours is in the past." Dick walked closer to Sid, his voice becoming more intimate, but somehow more commanding. "You want to talk about real innovation, Sid? Let's talk about it. Let's talk about what happened to your innovation when things got difficult." Sid's face began to change color. "Let's talk about 1958. When your show was canceled," Dick said quietly. Several people in the audience leaned forward, clearly recognizing this reference. "Tell them about the meeting with NBC, Sid," Dick continued. Sid tried to speak, but no sound came out. "No? You don't want to tell them?" Dick asked. "Then I will." Dick turned to address the room. In 1958, when Caesar's Hour was failing in the ratings, NBC called Sid in for a meeting about the show's future. They offered him a chance to retool the format, bring in new writers, try different approaches to get the audience back. Dick's voice was getting harder now, and Sid's response was to throw a tantrum. He told the executives they didn't understand comedy, that the audience was too stupid to appreciate real entertainment, that he wouldn't compromise his artistic vision for commercial success. Audible gasps came from several people in the audience. "But that wasn't the worst part, Sid. The worst part was what you said about your writing staff." Sid was now visibly shaking. "You told the NBC executives that the show was failing because your writers had lost their edge, that they were no longer capable of creating material worthy of your talents. You blamed Mel Brooks, you blamed Carl Reiner, you blamed Neil Simon, the same writers who had made you a star." The room erupted in shocked murmurs. "Those writers, your friends, your collaborators, found out what you'd said when NBC called them in to discuss replacing them. They learned that Sid Caesar, the man they'd helped make famous, had thrown them under the bus to protect his own reputation." Dick's voice was getting more passionate. "And you know what happened then, Sid? Those writers stopped taking your calls. They stopped pitching you ideas. They moved on to work with other performers who treated them with respect. And your career never recovered." Dick walked closer to Sid. "But here's the real tragedy of your story, Sid. It wasn't that your show got canceled. That happens to everyone eventually. It wasn't that the audience moved on, tastes change. The real tragedy was that you chose bitterness over adaptation, blame over growth, isolation over collaboration. The room was absolutely silent, except for Sid's labored breathing. You want to know why I've been successful, Sid? It's not just because I'm lucky. It's because I learned from your mistakes. When writers pitch me ideas, I listen to them. When directors suggest changes, I consider them. When other performers offer advice, I take it seriously. Dick paused, letting his words sink in. The difference between us isn't talent, Sid. It's not innovation. It's not even luck. The difference is that I understand comedy is collaborative, while you think it's about proving you're the smartest person in the room. Dick looked around the room one final time. You called me an amateur, Sid, but real professionals don't tear down their colleagues to build themselves up. Real professionals don't blame others for their own failures. And real professionals understand that the medium is bigger than any one performer, no matter how talented they might be. The silence that followed was deafening. Sid Caesar stood there, his face a mixture of rage, humiliation, and something that might have been recognition of the truth. Then something happened that no one in that ballroom expected. Sid's legs buckled, and he dropped to his knees. At first, people thought he was collapsing from the alcohol or the stress. Several people moved to help him, but then they realized what was happening. Sid Caesar was kneeling, deliberately, in front of Dick Van Dyke, in front of 180 people. "You're right," Sid whispered, his voice barely audible. "God help me, you're right." Dick looked down at this legendary figure on his knees, this man who had created television comedy, now reduced to a broken person confronting his own failures. "Sid," Dick said gently. "Get up." "I can't," Sid said, tears beginning to stream down his face. "I can't get up. What I did to those writers, what I became, I never thought—" "Yes, you did," Dick said quietly. "You knew exactly what you were doing. But Sid, that doesn't mean you can't choose to be better." Dick knelt down beside Sid, bringing himself to eye level. "The question isn't whether you've made mistakes," Dick said. "The question is what you're going to do now." Sid looked at Dick through his tears. "How can I fix this? How can I make it right with Mel, with Carl, with Neil? They won't even take my calls anymore." "You start by acknowledging what you did," Dick said. "You stop blaming others for your problems and take responsibility for your choices. You use whatever influence you have left to help people instead of hurting them." Sid nodded shakily. "I will. I swear I will." "Don't swear to me," Dick said. "Swear to the writers you blamed. Swear to the young comedians who could learn from your experience instead of your bitterness." Dick helped Sid to his feet. The room watched in amazement as the two comedians stood facing each other. "I need to call them," Sid said, his voice stronger now. "Mel, Carl, Neil, I need to apologize." "Yes, you do," Dick agreed. "But Sid, when you call them, don't do it for your own guilt. Do it because they deserved better from you, because they helped make you great and you repaid that loyalty with betrayal." Sid turned to address the room, his voice shaking but clear. "Ladies and gentlemen, I owe you all an enormous apology. I owe Dick Van Dyke an enormous apology. And I owe Mel Brooks, Carl Reiner, and Neil Simon the biggest apology of my life." Sid's voice got stronger as he continued. "I came here tonight thinking I was defending the integrity of television comedy, but I was really just displaying my own bitterness about being replaced by someone better than me. Dick Van Dyke didn't need to be torn down for me to feel important. His success didn't diminish my legacy. My own behavior did that." Sid looked directly at Dick. "You're not a lucky amateur. You're a professional who's earned every bit of success you've achieved through talent, hard work, and treating people with the respect I forgot how to show." The applause that followed was unlike anything anyone had heard at a comedy event. It wasn't just appreciation for entertainment. It was recognition of genuine human transformation happening in real time. Sid turned back to the audience one final time. "I'm going to do better. I'm going to use whatever career I have left to help other comedians instead of competing with them. and I'm going to spend whatever time I have remaining trying to earn back the respect I threw away. Over the next several weeks, the story dominated entertainment news. Sid Caesar kneels to Dick Van Dyke read headlines across the country. But the real story wasn't about humiliation or public confrontation. The real story was about accountability, change, and the possibility that even the most bitter performers could find their way back to grace. Sid did call Mel Brooks, Carl Reiner, and Neil Simon. The conversations were painful but healing. He apologized without making excuses, acknowledged the impact of his betrayal, and asked not for forgiveness but for the chance to prove he'd changed. More importantly, Sid changed how he approached his remaining career, focusing on mentoring young comedians instead of competing with successful ones. Dick, for his part, continued to be exactly who he'd always been, gracious, humble, and kind. But he'd also shown that kindness doesn't mean weakness, that you can be gentle while still being strong, that sometimes defending the future means confronting the past. Years later, in 1978, Sid Caesar was receiving a Lifetime Achievement Award. Dick Van Dyke was the presenter. "Ladies and gentlemen," Dick said to the audience, 13 years ago, this man taught me something important about courage. Not the courage to attack others when you feel threatened, but the courage to change yourself when you realize you've been wrong." When Sid accepted his award that night, he thanked Dick Van Dyke, not for forgiving him, not for helping him change, but for having the courage to tell him the truth when he needed to hear it most. The story of that night in 1965 became legendary in comedy circles, not because a legend was humiliated, but because two men found a way to turn conflict into growth, bitterness into wisdom, and competition into mutual respect. Sid Caesar really did call Dick Van Dyke a lucky amateur in front of 180 people, and Dick's response really did put Sid on his knees. But what happened next was something more powerful than public humiliation. It was public redemption that showed even the most successful people can learn, change, and become better versions of themselves. That's the real lesson of that evening. It's not about winning or losing, but about having the courage to grow, the wisdom to change, and the grace to help others do the same. But the transformation that began that night in 1965 had ripple effects that lasted for decades. Sid Caesar's apology to his former writing staff wasn't just a private matter, it became a public reconciliation that changed how the comedy industry viewed collaboration and respect. 3 weeks after the Friars Club confrontation, Sid called Carl Reiner personally. The conversation lasted 4 hours. Sid didn't just apologize. He listened as Carl explained the pain and betrayal the writers had felt when they learned Sid had blamed them for his show's failure. "You have to understand, Sid," Carl said, his voice still carrying hurt after 7 years. "We believed in you. We worked 18-hour days to make you look brilliant. And when things got tough, instead of protecting us the way we'd protected you, you threw us away like we were nothing." Sid absorbed every word without defending himself. When Carl finished, Sid said simply, "You're right. I was wrong. I was scared and bitter, and I took it out on the people who least deserved it. I can't undo that, but I can promise it will never happen again." The reconciliation with Mel Brooks was even more emotional. Mel had been particularly hurt by Sid's betrayal because he'd considered Sid not just a boss but a mentor and friend. "You taught me how to write comedy," Mel told Sid during their reunion lunch, "but you also taught me how not to treat people. When I started producing my own projects, I made sure to always protect my writers, always give them credit, always remember that success is collaborative." Sid nodded. "I'm glad something good came from my mistakes." Something good did come from it. But it shouldn't have taken Dick Van Dyke calling you out for you to learn basic decency. Neil Simon's response was different, but equally powerful. When Sid reached out to him, Neil was working on a new play. Instead of just accepting Sid's apology, Neil offered him something unexpected. "I'm writing a character based partly on you," Neil said. "A comedy legend who's lost his way, who's forgotten what made him great in the first place. Would you be interested in playing him?" Sid was stunned. You want me to play myself? My failures? I want you to help audiences understand that even the most successful people can lose their way, and that it's never too late to find it again. The play, Laughter After Midnight, opened on Broadway in 1967 with Sid Caesar in the lead role. It wasn't a huge commercial success, but it was a critical triumph that re-established Sid as a serious performer capable of genuine emotional depth. More importantly, it showed that he was willing to examine his own failures publicly, to use his experience to help others avoid the same mistakes. Dick Van Dyke attended opening night and was genuinely moved by Sid's performance. After the show, he went backstage to congratulate his former adversary. That was brave, Sid. Not many people would have the courage to expose their own vulnerabilities like that. I learned something from you that night at the Friars Club, Sid replied. Real courage isn't about proving you're better than other people. It's about admitting when you're wrong and doing whatever it takes to become better. The friendship that developed between Dick and Sid became one of Hollywood's most unexpected relationships. They began appearing together at comedy events, with Sid often introducing Dick as the man who taught me how to be a professional. In 1970, when Dick was developing a new variety show for CBS, he surprised everyone by asking Sid to be a regular guest. Sid Caesar understands sketch comedy in ways that I never will, Dick explained to network executives. His experience and my energy could create something special. The collaboration resulted in some of television's most memorable comedy moments. Sid's sketches with Dick combined the older comedian's sophisticated writing with Dick's physical comedy skills, creating a unique blend that appealed to multiple generations. But perhaps the most significant change was in how Sid began treating young comedians. In 1972, a struggling writer named David Letterman approached Sid for advice. Instead of dismissing him or competing with him, Sid spent hours helping David develop his unique voice. The mistake I made, Sid told David, was thinking that helping other people succeed would somehow diminish my own success. But Dick Van Dyke taught me that the opposite is true. Lifting others up makes you more successful, not less. David Letterman later credited Sid Caesar with teaching him not just about comedy, but about leadership. Sid showed me that you can be demanding without being cruel, that you can maintain standards without destroying people. The night at the Friars Club had created a template for how conflicts in the entertainment industry could be resolved through honest confrontation and genuine change. Other performers began using Dick's approach, calling out bad behavior calmly and specifically, demanding accountability rather than just fighting back. In 1975, when a powerful director was publicly humiliating a young actress on a film set, veteran actor James Stewart stepped in using Dick's method. That's inappropriate behavior, Stewart said calmly. You need to apologize to her, and then you need to change how you're directing this scene. The director, shamed by Stewart's quiet authority, complied immediately. The Van Dyke method, as it came to be known informally, emphasized dignity over aggression, specific accountability over general criticism, and the possibility of redemption over permanent condemnation. It became a model for how powerful people could be confronted without destroying them. When Sid Caesar died in 2014, Dick Van Dyke spoke at his memorial service. The eulogy was remarkable not for what it said about Sid's early success, but for what it revealed about his transformation. Sid Caesar made mistakes, Dick told the assembled crowd of comedy legends. He hurt people he should have protected, blamed others for his own failures, and let bitterness poison his relationships. But what made Sid special wasn't that he was perfect, it was that he was willing to change. Dick looked out at the audience, seeing faces of comedians from multiple generations who had been influenced by Sid's later example. The last 30 years of Sid's life were about redemption, about using his experience to help others, about proving that it's never too late to become a better person. He mentored young comedians, supported struggling writers, and used his platform to lift others up instead of tearing them down. Dick's voice became emotional. That night in 1965, when I confronted Sid about his behavior, I wasn't trying to destroy him, I was trying to save him from destroying himself. and I'm grateful that he had the courage to hear what I was saying, to acknowledge his mistakes, and to spend the rest of his life proving that people can change. As Dick concluded his eulogy, he offered a final thought that captured the real lesson of that night 50 years earlier. Sid Caesar taught me that calling someone out on their behavior isn't about winning or losing. It's about caring enough about them to tell them the truth, even when that truth is painful. Real friends don't let friends destroy themselves through bad choices. They intervene, they confront, and they offer the possibility of redemption. The story of Sid Caesar calling Dick Van Dyke a lucky amateur had become more than just an entertainment industry anecdote. It had become a template for accountability, change, and the possibility that even the deepest professional conflicts could be resolved through honest confrontation and genuine growth. Dick Van Dyke's calm response didn't just put Sid Caesar on his knees, it put him on a path to becoming a better person, a better mentor, and ultimately a better legacy than his early success had ever provided. That's the real power of standing up for what's right. It doesn't just correct bad behavior in the moment. It creates the possibility for transformation that can last a lifetime and influence generations. Sid Caesar was indeed a lucky amateur that night in 1965. Lucky that Dick Van Dyke cared enough to tell him the truth. An amateur at understanding how to handle that truth with grace. But he learned, he changed, and he spent the rest of his life proving that even legends can become better than they ever thought possible. That's not just a story about two comedians. That's a story about what's possible when we have the courage to confront wrongdoing and the wisdom to offer redemption alongside accountability. It's about the difference between tearing people down and building them back up stronger than they were before. And it's about Dick Van Dyke's remarkable ability to defend what was right while still believing in the possibility that people could choose to be better than their worst moments.